After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and especially since the start of the war in Ukraine, the media all around the world pay special attention to the role of Christianity and especially the Russian Orthodox Church in the war and Russian internal affairs in general. When it comes to the media, however, you can never put your full trust in them on any issue. The media chases hot headlines, simplified stories happening in a short time. You will never get a detailed analysis put in a proper historical, social and political context from the media. Yes, unlike the social media discourse created by everyday users, the TV, newspapers and big media portals are run by professionally trained journalists who have the means, infrastructure and experience to get immediate access to world leaders, distant locations and live events. At the same time, the media narrative is set by two major actors: the ones who fund the outlet, shareholders and advertisers, and the audience who make ratings. The information online is much richer and diverse. Some people just speculate and express their opinions based on feelings, personal preferences, and zero evidence, but some are actual witnesses and participants of the events they share online before any journalist even makes it to the location. Yet, it is way harder to filter through information online, unless you have some expertise and understanding of the situation yourself. The legacy media, however, does not give us much choice. People usually choose the outlet that aligns with their political views and consume its content uncritically. In the 21st century, when the audience of top podcasts and online media significantly outnumbers traditional media, you cannot trust the media with anything more than basic news, currency and stock exchange rates, and weather forecasts. Every time I learn something deeper than a mere consumer, I see the media creating a totally distorted image of this issue, be it public health, gender dynamics, or even basic biology, to say nothing about politics, economics, and religion. Let me give you a couple of examples from my area of expertise to demonstrate how simplified, superficial, and often misleading the image of Russian Christianity created by the media is. One of the most ethnically, culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse countries in the world, Russia has always been misrepresented in the media and public perception using simplification and generalization. Both Russian opponents and sympathizers have quite an obscure view of the country and her people. Most of my examples will be characteristic of the so-called left and right media alike, because none of them have proven to show objectivity and attention to detail. The first misconception is that Russia is a Christian and traditionalist country. This is not entirely false, but this idea is so simplistic and superficial that it actually misleads both pro-Russian and anti-Russian politicians. Yes, compared to many first world Western nations, especially her geopolitical competitors, Russia is more conservative and traditional. Most Russians value families, can tell a man from a woman, and love children. However, there are a few issues with labeling Russia as traditionally conservative. First, oftentimes Russians go to another extreme. They do not just refuse to recognize transgenderism or non-binary sexual identities, but eagerly and enthusiastically harass, bully, discriminate, and even attack gay people or people they suspect of being gay. The issue is not with rights to marry or organize pride events, it's simply very dangerous and even life-threatening to be gay in today's Russia. Even if we disregard this as a side effect of traditional conservatism, the main problem is that most Russians fail to live up to their own standards. As I have already pointed out in one of my videos, the statistics kept by the Russian official sources do not support the traditional conservative image. Russia has the highest rate of abortion per capita in the world, one of the highest divorce rates, single-parent households, child homelessness, drug and alcohol abuse, and HIV. The Russian population currently steadily declines, just like in most of the world. In this video, I am not expressing my own opinions on abortion, divorce, and single mothers. I'm just pointing out the contradiction between the reality of everyday life and the declared conservative values. When it comes to Russia as a Christian country, it is also a very rough simplification and overgeneralization. The Russian Muslim population is one of the largest in the world among traditionally non-Muslim countries. There are different stats, but some censuses indicate up to 16%, about every sixth Russian as a Muslim. Many people are very surprised when they hear this number, and that is very illustrative. This shows that people have no idea that there are many Muslim majority regions, some of which have been a part of Russia for 500 years. In some places like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, conquered by Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, Islam may be more of a national identity, not as actively practiced. Many people in these regions are generational converts to Orthodox Christianity or simply non-religious. However, in other places, especially in the North Caucasus region, the majority of the population is practicing Muslims. The brightest examples would be the Chechen Republic, hardly even controlled by Moscow, and Dagestan, the multi-ethnic region home to notorious MMA fighter Khabib Nurmagomedov. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the biggest cities have been flooded by migrants from various post-Soviet republics, especially from predominantly Muslim Central Asia: Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so on. Many of these people have naturalized and become Russian citizens. When it comes to the majority religion, Orthodox Christianity, the numbers that the Church claims are actually very tricky. As I have discussed in one of my videos, the question of how many Orthodox Christians are there in Russia has no simple answer. The statistics indicate about 60% of the Russian population, but the devil is in the details. We only get such a large number if the question asked is something like, "What is your religious identity?" or "Do you consider yourself an Orthodox Christian?" It would be safe to assume that most of these people are also baptized, either as infants or as converts. However, if we apply a more specific criterion, something to do with religious practice and active church life, the numbers drop significantly to 3 to 5%. Whether it is church attendance, reading of the Bible, regular prayer, or partaking of the holy sacraments, there is only a minority of the population that could be considered genuine devoted believers. For most, Orthodox Christianity is a national, cultural, sometimes ethnic identity, family tradition, or even political affiliation. Again, I am not judging such people or saying that they are not real Christians. What I am saying is that this does not look like a Christian country in a strict sense, and in combination with the life choices that I have indicated earlier, Russia as a traditionally conservative Christian country is, for the most part, a myth. The next misleading simplification is the idea that Christianity in Russia is only represented by the Russian Orthodox Church. There are many aspects to this, and many points I can make to show how superficial this idea might be. Let's only address the most obvious ones: authenticity and diversity. In one of my recent videos, I tried to tackle the question of how old the Russian Orthodox Church is. This question is complicated by many internal and external conflicts that either destroyed the church leadership or seriously contested its trustworthiness. Many church reforms and schisms have occurred because of the changes within the church structure, canonicity, and relationships with the state that many of the clergy and faithful deemed unacceptable. The church reform of the Patriarch Nikon in the 17th century, the abolishment of the Patriarchate by Peter the Great, the pledge of allegiance to the communist state by the patriarchal placeholder, future Patriarch Sergei, the state-initiated bishops' council that elected him a patriarch, the church diplomacy of the 20th century promoting the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, and the alliance of Patriarch Kirill with the Putin state power, all these things undermine the authenticity of the Russian Church in the eyes of many Christians, clergy and laymen. Next, the great religious diversity in Russia goes almost completely unnoticed and neglected by the media. You can hardly find any mention of Russian evangelical Protestants who have existed in Russia since the mid-19th century and played an important role in the history of underground dissident resistance. You won't hear about the unprecedented missionary activities in the far north, with a large population converted to a Baptist or Pentecostal faith, abandoning their drinking habit, starting schools and getting passports. And you most certainly won't read about multiple ministries serving homeless, imprisoned, orphaned, disabled, and addicted people in Russia. Old believers, an umbrella term for many conservative Orthodox communities split from the Russian Church in the 17th century, have preserved the old liturgy, scripture, and tradition of their forefathers. They not only spread all across the globe, but many still live in Russia, both in isolated areas and among other fellow Russians in urban centers. When have you last heard about them in the news? The next two misconceptions are about the Russian Orthodox Church. Surely, it is the largest and dominant community in Russia. But what do we read or hear about the Church? All simplifications, generalizations, and superficialities. The biggest one that makes my blood boil is when the Church is reduced to just her leadership. I don't just think it's a wrong perception of the Russian Orthodox Church in particular. It is simply unprofessional for a journalist or political scientist to represent any group of people in this way. Let's imagine a journalist decides to report on a big factory. He comes there and interviews the general manager. Then he talks to the public relations officer. Maybe he is taken on a short excursion around the factory. Then he comes home, writes a report, and publishes an article. What do you learn from such a piece of work? The official stats, the basics of the general strategy, the main PR points? What about the everyday situation, workers' concerns and problems, their satisfaction and motivation, their relationships with various kinds of leadership, the efficiency, logistics, marketing, distribution, and so on and so on and so forth? The same with the Church. Is leadership important? For sure. It has been historically and especially now, with such a strong autocratic leader as Patriarch Kirill. But the Russian Orthodox Church is a huge galaxy of eparchies, parishes, communities, monasteries, educational institutions, groups, clubs, and thousands of people. How can we reduce millions of people to only a leader and maybe his apparatus? Can we talk about the whole of Russia based on what Putin and some of his ministers say? Can we judge the whole United States by what Donald Trump, his press secretary, and maybe J.D. Vance are saying? The Russian Orthodox Church is huge. What the leadership says and does matters, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. The next misconception when it comes to the Church is that most of the media, sympathetic or not, tends to overestimate her political influence and role. The Patriarch is seen as some kind of spiritual advisor to Putin and the Grey Cardinal of sorts. And the Church is perceived as almost as important as the Ministry of Defense or Internal Affairs. The Church has always strived for political power and influence. Theologically, it has been framed as symphonia, a harmonious co-rulership of the secular leader and the Church Patriarch. Historically, this was only the case 2 times. First, Tsar Mikhail Romanov co-ruled with Patriarch Filaret, who was not only his own biological father, but also a much more influential and powerful political figure. At the time Mikhail was elected as a new Tsar, after the Rurikovichi dynasty was interrupted, Filaret was incarcerated in Poland, and moreover, as a tonsured monk, he could not hold a political office. The second case was Mikhail's son, Tsar Alexei. He co-ruled with his spiritual advisor, Patriarch Nikon. This union proved to be much less sustainable, and in the battle of ambitions, Tsar Alexei took over. Nikon became the last dethroned patriarch so far, and since then, the secular power has never allowed the Church's political ambitions to grow so significantly. Alexei's son, Peter the Great, abolished the Patriarchate and made the Church a state department. This only ended in 1917, when after the abdication of the last monarch, Nicholas II, the Church managed to elect a new Patriarch, Tikhon. However, at the moment of the election, the Bolsheviks had already won the revolution and established the atheist ideology all over the country. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Church managed to gain some political influence, but formally, Russia is still a secular state according to the constitution. Besides, the Church's influence on state power has fluctuated. The peak power was around the early 2010s, when, after the Pussy Riot protest in Christ the Savior Cathedral, the Church lobbied for the anti-blasphemy laws and the restriction of missionary activities of other religious communities. However, currently the Church's real political influence is limited to religion, with significant concessions to Islam, and traditional family values. Even the very limited restriction on abortion and anti-LGBT legislation was only adopted after the start of the war in Ukraine, the imposition of sanctions on Russia, significant growth of international isolation, and the new wave of the conflict with the West. This testifies that the current geopolitical situation has played a much more significant role in this legislation than the Church, which has lobbied for these reforms for decades. The influence of the Church and the Patriarch personally on foreign policy is even less significant. All of his speeches and addresses are reactive. Patriarch Kirill justifies what is already happening without any prior consultation or briefing with him. By the transcripts of his sermons in the first days of the war, it was evident that he was not informed in advance and could not figure out his official position, at least until a week into the war. Lastly, I would like to address one more simplification of the situation in Russia. Judging by the active support of the war by the Patriarch, many media narratives conclude that, at least formally, the Russian war ideology is based on Orthodox Christianity. This is another misleading exaggeration. Certainly, there are multiple references to religion made by even secular ideologues of the war. One of the key issues is the situation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has become one of the negotiation points. However, most politicians have to take into account a large presence of Muslims among the Russian military, including the leadership. However, if you read or listen to propaganda points offered by the Russian state as the justification for the war, Orthodox Christianity only plays a secondary supplementary role. Apart from purely political and diplomatic claims, the major ideological narrative refers not to religion, but to the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet war against Nazi Germany. For decades, Russian propaganda has accused Ukraine of the rehabilitation of Nazism. The Maidan Revolution of 2013, annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, all these are put into the context of revisiting the results and outcomes of that war. the cult of the Great Patriotic War and victory has been maintained for many generations. It has become a vital part of the Soviet and post-Soviet culture and historical memory. Although there are not so many veterans still alive, there is not a family in Russia that hasn't lost someone in the war. The casualties of the Soviet Union are roughly estimated as 27 million lives, and the memories, monuments, and heroes of the war are considered sacred. Generally speaking, the cult of victory provokes a much more emotional response from a much larger part of the Russian population than Orthodox Christianity. Hence, the Ukrainian military and state power are routinely called Nazis by the Russian propaganda and state media. Even though Ukraine was one of the first regions occupied by Nazi Germany and suffering the heaviest losses, despite the fact that the Ukrainian president is a Russian-speaking Jew who lost most of his extended family in Holocaust, despite the same reverence towards the war and the Victory Day in Ukraine, at least until the Russian attack, these propaganda points work perfectly. The majority of the Russian population believes them. When an expert watches the movie depicting his profession, he is usually either amused or outraged. For artistic purposes, the movies show only extreme cases, make them unrealistically picturesque, and distort the everyday reality of what is really going on. The media does something very similar. A hot headline, sensational claims, and simplified black and white representation of events on a short time scale is what sells the best. You absolutely cannot trust the media's interpretation of highly complex situations and phenomena. Russia in general, and Russian Christianity in particular, is one of such complex things. Even a simple search on Google, or if you read Russian, one visit to the website of the Moscow Patriarchate and skimming through the official speeches of the Patriarch will clearly demonstrate how primitive and obscure media accounts are. I have addressed the main examples, the most outrageous and misleading ones. What are some examples in the media that distort the image of Russian Christianity for you? Maybe there are some media sources you actually can trust when it comes to Christianity in Russia. Share in the comments. Please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all next time.